The woman walked into the courtroom in Suffolk County, New York, with a cold expression that was almost impossible to read. In front of her was not a minor charge, not a family argument that had gone too far, and not a tragedy she could easily explain by saying she was only standing on the outside. She was not Thomas Valva's biological mother. She was his father's fiancée. And the 8-year-old boy the entire trial was talking about was an autistic child who died inside the very home where he should have been protected. In court, the story Angela Pollina wanted the world to see was not a story of cruelty. It was wrapped in the appearance of discipline, family chaos, children who were described as difficult to control, and a father she could try to place most of the responsibility on. If that was all someone heard, some people might think this was a family that had lost control, a home with too much tension, a woman living with children who were not biologically hers. An incident she could try to explain by saying she was not the final decision maker, but then the evidence came out, and from that moment, the story Angela wanted to build began to collapse. On the 17th of January, 2020, in Center Moriches, Long Island, the weather was dangerously cold. Outside, the temperature had dropped below freezing. But inside that home, Thomas Valva and his 10-year-old brother were not sleeping in a warm bedroom like other children. According to prosecutors, the two brothers had been forced to sleep in an unheated garage, not just once, not just for a brief moment, but as part of a pattern of harsh treatment that had continued before the tragedy happened. Thomas Valva was only 8 years old. He was an autistic child. He needed more patience, more protection, and more care. But instead of being protected, he was placed in an environment his small body could not survive. That morning, when emergency responders were called, it was already too late. Thomas was no longer alive. And that cold garage was no longer just part of the house. It became the center of a case that shook all of Long Island. But what made this case even more haunting was that warnings had appeared before. Before Thomas died, there had been multiple signs that he and his brother were living in danger. Teachers and people around them had expressed concerns. Reports had been sent to the child protection system. Warnings had existed. But Thomas remained in that house, still under the control of those adults. And in the end, the little boy no longer had a chance to be saved. Before the jury, Angela Pollina could try to create distance between herself and Thomas's death. She could make it seem as if Michael Valva's actions had gone beyond what she could control. She could say she was not Thomas's biological father, not the only person in the house, not the only person responsible. But prosecutors did not see the case that way. They said Angela Pollina was not an outsider. They said she was part of the environment that left Thomas isolated, neglected, and placed in danger. They said she knew what was happening, and they said she had enough chances to stop it, but did not. What you are about to watch is not an ordinary family crime case. This is the story of an 8-year-old boy who died from hypothermia in the unheated garage of a home on Long Island. This is the story of a former NYPD officer, the victim's biological father, and the woman engaged to him, both of whom were eventually convicted of manslaughter. And this is also the story of a system that had received warnings, but still did not intervene in time before Thomas Valva no longer had a chance to survive. Every detail you are watching has been verified through investigative records, testimony in court, prosecutors' reports, the jury's verdict, the sentence handed down in Suffolk County, and the grand jury report on failures within the child protection system. If you have never heard this story before, prepare yourself. Because what happened in Center Moriches, Long Island, on the 17th of January 2020 will force you to question discipline, neglect, power inside a family, and the terrifying line between a chaotic home and a place that can destroy a child. To understand why Angela Pollina eventually had to stand before the court, be convicted of second-degree murder, and receive a sentence of 25 years to life, we have to go back to before the morning Thomas Valva was found unresponsive, before the cold garage became the center of the case, before the warnings were looked back on as missed chances, before Michael Valva and Angela Pollina were both convicted in the death of an 8-year-old boy, and before Thomas Valva became the name that forced all of Suffolk County to face a painful question: how many people saw the warning signs, but no one was able to save him? Thomas Valva was only 8 years old when his name became known across Long Island, New York, for reasons no child should ever be remembered. He lived in Center Moriches, in Suffolk County, inside a home that, from the outside, looked like a family residence. But behind that door was a household where 2 young boys with special needs were subjected to harsh treatment, isolation, and conditions that prosecutors later said no child could safely endure. Thomas was the son of Michael Valva, a former NYPD officer, and Justina Zubko Valva, his biological mother. After Michael and Justina's marriage broke apart, Thomas and his older brother lived with Michael and his fiancée, Angela Pollina. Pollina also had children of her own in the home, creating a blended household that should have been built around protection. Instead, the evidence later showed a pattern of cruelty and neglect that reached its final point in January 2020. Before Thomas died, the warning signs were already there. Teachers and school staff had raised concerns about Thomas and his brother. Their biological mother had also tried to sound alarms about their condition and safety. Reports later described complaints about the boys being hungry, arriving at school in troubling condition, and showing signs that something inside the home was wrong. Suffolk County Child Protective Services had been contacted more than once, and after Thomas's death, the handling of those warnings became a major public issue. A grand jury report would later examine how the child protection system responded before the tragedy. But at the time Thomas needed help the most, those warnings did not remove him from danger. Inside Michael Valva and Angela Pollina's home, there were cameras. That fact became central to the investigation because the house itself had recorded pieces of what happened. Prosecutors later said the cameras showed that Thomas and his older brother were forced to sleep in the garage. The garage was not heated. It was not a bedroom. It was not a safe place for children to sleep in the middle of a Long Island winter. One camera in the garage was reportedly positioned low and aimed toward the floor. That camera, according to investigators, was labeled in a way that referred to the space as the children's room. To prosecutors, that label mattered. It suggested the garage was not used once by accident. It had become part of how the boys were treated. The conditions grew especially dangerous in the days before the 17th of January 2020. The outside temperature dropped well below freezing, with reports describing it at around 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Thomas and his older brother were made to sleep on the garage floor without the warmth and bedding a child would need. The video evidence later described in court showed the boys cold and shivering. In a home filled with adults, cameras, bedrooms, and basic supplies, Thomas was still left in a place that could not protect him from the cold. The final night was not described by prosecutors as a sudden accident. It was part of a longer pattern. Thomas and his brother were forced to spend the night in the unheated garage. For a child as young as Thomas, hours in that environment were dangerous. Hypothermia does not need a dramatic scene to become deadly. It can happen quietly, as the body loses heat faster than it can replace it. By the morning of January 17, Thomas's condition had become critical. That morning, evidence later shown in court described Thomas as weak and unable to function normally. Instead of being treated like a child in medical danger, he was still being handled as if he were a discipline problem. Court testimony and reporting described Michael Valva yelling at Thomas and using cold water outside in the freezing weather to wash him. Angela Pollina was also present in the home and was later accused by prosecutors of knowing the danger Thomas was in. At one point, according to trial testimony, a child in the home asked why Thomas could not walk, and Pollina allegedly referred to Thomas being affected by hypothermia. That detail mattered because it suggested awareness. The adults in the home could see that Thomas was not simply tired or misbehaving. He was in serious physical distress. Eventually, Thomas became unresponsive. Michael Valva called 911, but the story he gave dispatchers was not the story investigators would later find in the evidence. He said Thomas had fallen in the driveway while waiting for the school bus and had lost consciousness. That explanation created the first version of the case. A child had supposedly suffered an accident outside the home. When first responders arrived, Michael was performing CPR on Thomas in the basement. Emergency personnel took Thomas to the hospital, but he did not survive. At the hospital, Thomas's body temperature told a different story. Authorities said his temperature was around 76 degrees Fahrenheit, far below normal and dangerously low. The medical finding pointed toward hypothermia. That single fact began to pull the case away from Michael's driveway story. A simple fall outside while waiting for a school bus could not explain the evidence that Thomas had been exposed to severe cold for an extended period. The investigation began to shift from a medical emergency to a criminal case. Police returned to the home and began looking closely at the timeline. The surveillance system became one of the most important sources of evidence. Investigators reviewed the videos and saw that Thomas and his brother had been kept in the garage. The footage contradicted the claim that the crisis began with a fall in the driveway. It showed the boys in a cold space where no child should have been left overnight. It also showed the home had been monitored in a way that made the adults' claims harder to accept. This was not a hidden space no one knew about. It was a space watched by cameras. As detectives continued reviewing the evidence, They also focused on the behavior of Michael Valva and Angela Pollina after Thomas's condition became critical. Investigators looked at statements, video, messages, and the sequence of events that morning. Public reporting later described evidence suggesting Michael and Pollina discussed deleting video footage or changing access to the home's camera system after Thomas died. Prosecutors used that kind of evidence to argue that the adults were not simply confused in an emergency. They were trying to control what investigators could see. The case widened as investigators looked back beyond the morning of January 17. Thomas's death was not treated as an isolated act. Prosecutors built a picture of an extended environment of neglect and harsh treatment. They pointed to the boys being forced into the garage, being denied basic comfort, and being treated differently from other children in the home. They also pointed to the repeated warnings from outside the home, including concerns from school staff and Thomas's mother. Those warnings became part of the larger question. How did a child who had already been the subject of concern remain in the same environment until it was too late? On the 24th of January 2020, 1 week after Thomas died, Michael Valva and Angela Pollina were arrested. Both were charged with second-degree murder and related child endangerment offenses. Michael, the father, had been the one who called 911 and gave the driveway story. Pollina, his fiancée, had lived in the home and was accused of taking part in the treatment of Thomas and his brother. Both pleaded not guilty at first, and both cases moved forward separately. There is no full public interrogation transcript that allows every question and answer to be recreated. For that reason, the responsible way to tell this case is through the evidence that became public in court and reporting. Michael's initial account was that Thomas fell in the driveway. Investigators later determined that account did not match the video, the medical findings, or the timeline. Pollina initially denied responsibility, and her defense later argued that Michael was the one primarily responsible. But prosecutors said both adults knew what was happening in the home, both had power to help Thomas, and both failed him. Michael Valva was tried first in 2022. The trial took place in Riverhead, Long Island, and focused heavily on what Michael did and failed to do as Thomas's father. Prosecutors argued that he forced Thomas to sleep in the unheated garage, failed to get help in time, and lied to first responders about how his son became unresponsive. They presented evidence from the cameras, testimony about Thomas's condition, medical findings, and information about the treatment of Thomas and his brother before the final night. The defense tried to shift much of the blame onto Angela Pollina. Michael's attorneys suggested Pollina controlled much of the household and had a major influence over discipline. They tried to argue that Michael did not intend for Thomas to die, and that the state had not proven the mental element required for murder. But prosecutors came back to the core facts. Michael was Thomas's father. He knew the garage was cold. He knew Thomas had been there. He saw his son's condition that morning, and when he called 911, he did not tell the truth about the garage. The jury heard about Thomas's body temperature, the freezing weather, the surveillance footage, the driveway story, and the history of concerns before his death. They also heard about the way Thomas and his brother had been treated inside the home. On the 4th of November 2022, the jury found Michael Valva guilty of second-degree murder and the related charges. The verdict meant the jury rejected the idea that this was only a tragic mistake or a discipline decision gone wrong. They found him criminally responsible for Thomas's death. Michael Valva was sentenced on the 8th of December 2022 to 25 years to life in prison. In court, he apologized and said he did not want his son to die. But the sentence reflected the severity of the evidence. The court recognized that Thomas had been placed in deadly conditions by the person who was supposed to protect him. For Michael, the legal outcome was clear. The former NYPD officer and father of Thomas would spend decades in prison, with the possibility of parole only after a long minimum term. Angela Pollina's trial came next in 2023. Her case focused on whether she, as Michael's fiancée and an adult in the home, was also legally responsible for Thomas's death. Prosecutors argued she was not a passive witness. They said she participated in the environment that led to Thomas being forced into the garage and denied basic care. They said she knew what was happening to Thomas and his brother and did not stop it. They also argued that she recognized the danger Thomas was in that morning, but still failed to get him help in time. Pollina's defense placed blame on Michael. Her attorneys argued she did not directly cause Thomas's death and that Michael, as Thomas's father, bore the main responsibility. Pollina testified during her trial, and reporting from the courtroom described her acknowledging that she had been cruel, while still disputing the murder charge. But prosecutors told jurors that cruelty inside the home was not separate from the legal case. It was part of how Thomas ended up in the garage, exposed to cold long enough for his body to fail. The jury in Pollina's case heard evidence about the garage, the camera footage, Thomas's condition, the way the boys were treated, and Pollina's role inside the household. The prosecution argued that she had the ability to act and the responsibility to protect a child in danger, even if Thomas was not her biological son. In March 2023, Angela Pollina was found guilty of second-degree murder and related charges. On the 11th of April, 2023, Pollina was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The judge imposed the maximum sentence for the main charge. In remarks reported from court, he spoke sharply about the conditions Thomas had been forced to endure, comparing them to basic comforts Pollina would still have in prison. Pollina's attorney said she did not believe she was guilty of murder and planned to appeal, but the sentence stood. The legal cases against Michael Valva and Angela Pollina ended with the same main result. Both were convicted of second-degree murder, and both received sentences of 25 years to life. But the impact of Thomas's death extended beyond the courtroom. Suffolk County faced intense scrutiny over how child protection officials handled the warnings that came before January 2020. A special grand jury report examined the failures and concerns in the system, and the county later announced reforms, including changes meant to reduce bias in removal decisions and improve how children at risk are evaluated. Thomas Valva's case remains one of the most painful child neglect and homicide cases in New York because of how many warning signs existed before his death. This was not a child hidden from the world. Thomas went to school. Adults outside the home saw signs of concern. His mother tried to raise alarms. The home had cameras. The garage was monitored. Yet the danger continued until the morning Thomas could no longer survive it. In the end, the story of Thomas Valva was not only about one freezing night, it was about a child who needed warmth, food, safety, and protection, but instead was treated as a problem to be punished. It was about a father who called 911 with a false explanation, a fiancée who lived in the home and was convicted of sharing responsibility, and an investigation that used video, medical evidence, witness concerns, and the truth of the garage to uncover what really happened. Thomas was 8 years old. His life ended inside a home where he should have been safe, and the courts later held both Michael Valva and Angela Pollina responsible for the conditions that led to his death. The strongest message from Thomas Valva's case is that neglect can be visible long before it becomes fatal. Thomas was not a child no one knew existed. He went to school. Adults saw warning signs. Concerns were raised. Yet the system around him failed to protect him before one freezing night in a garage became the final chapter of his life. The lesson is that children with special needs must be heard through the people who notice changes in them. A hungry child, a frightened child, a child arriving at school cold, dirty, or withdrawn is not just a family matter. Those signs can be evidence of danger. When teachers, relatives, neighbors, or parents outside the home speak up, their warnings must be taken seriously and acted on quickly. This case also shows that punishment after the fact cannot replace protection before harm happens. Michael Valva and Angela Pollina received prison sentences, but no sentence can return Thomas to safety. His story remains a painful reminder that child protection is not only a legal duty, it is a human responsibility. When a child is suffering, delay can become deadly, and silence can become another failure.